Hey everybody, welcome back. This week we're going to go over adulthood and midlife. So the unit learning objectives that I have for you this week are the things that I want you to be able to know how to do by the time we get done with this unit. So that's with this video lecture, and that's also with the reading from the textbook for this week and the related activities. All right, so the first thing I want you to be able to do is I want you to be able to explain the physical and cognitive changes in midlife. So these are things like menopause or different types of intelligence. This could even be things with personality that we'll talk about. I also want you to be able to distinguish between crystallized and fluid intelligences and explain how they change across the lifespan. I want you to be able to explain and provide examples of selective optimization with compensation. I want you to be able to identify and provide examples of post-formal thought. I want you to be able to reflect on the Big Five and how it influences your own and others' development. I want you to be able to describe generativity versus stagnation and how it influences people's lives. I also want you to be able to list and define the different roles related to grandparenthood. All right, let's get started. So midlife. What ages are considered midlife? So think about this before you move on. I've heard some very, very sad answers to this that have aged me a lot. So what do you think is considered midlife? So midlife is considered ages 40s up to the 60s, and sometimes students have it a lot lower than what it actually is. So midlife is considered 40s to 60s. So during this time, people in women's bodies often will start moving toward menopause. And so most people know that menopause happens around age 50, and this is where ovulation stops and the menstrual cycle also stops because of the decline of estrogen and some other different hormones. So perimenopause then is the time when a person's body starts moving toward menopause. It's not something that just happens one day. And so during perimenopause, you'll see some irregularities with menstrual cycles. So sometimes you'll see heavier bleeding, or you'll see cycles be a lot longer or shorter. So typically cycles go from anywhere from 21 days up to 35 days. If you have a body that menstruates, then if you have periods that cycle faster than 21 days or past 35 days, you may want to go and see a medical professional because there may be some things going on. Some people who are going through perimenopause include things like hot flashes. Bone density can start decreasing because estrogen actually protects our bone density. So you start losing some bone mass, and it's harder to build it back up during perimenopause and full menopause. There's other things like increase in LDL cholesterol or having issues with sleeping. There's a whole bunch of other types of things that go on during this time. Today on social media, I asked the people who are on my social media, what are some things that you wish people told you about menopause before you went through it? And a lot of people said that perimenopause was a huge thing. They had no idea that there would be a period in their life that would move them toward going to menopause. And they wish that somebody would have told them about it, or like having extra shirts at work in case you sweat so much, or night sweats. Someone else on social media said they wish someone told them that they should have some night clothes right by their bed so they can just change in the middle of the night. And so menopause, then, if we're going to define it, is the absence of menstrual cycles for 12 months straight. So sometimes people, when they're going through this, they'll have some of those irregular menstrual periods where they won't have one for like 3 months, and then they'll start up again. And that's all toward the body moving toward not having it anymore. So there's different, you may be wanting to know, what are the typical age ranges? I know that the book just mentioned specifically 50. That's actually not even the actual mean for it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Typical menopause can happen anywhere from age 45 up to 55. Yes, people have it outside of this age range, but that's just the typical menopause range. If it's outside of these ages, then that's atypical development. For this, the mean age of menopause is actually 51. So early menopause, it's considered early menopause if you have menopause between age 40 up to 45. And it's considered premature menopause if you go through menopause before age 40. However, there's a whole bunch of times or reasons why people may go through premature menopause. And this could be something like treatments for cancer, so like radiation or chemotherapy, or if they have something called premature ovarian insufficiency or POI. And so if someone has to have a hysterectomy for whatever reason, if they have endometriosis, then that may mean that they have to have a hysterectomy and they go into menopause a lot earlier. So when people go through menopause, the estrogen levels drop radically, and we talked about the loss in bone density. So this is one of the reasons that people in women bodies are more subject to having osteoporosis or really porous and fragile bones. And so that's something that people need to keep in mind as they move across the lifespan. And then we also have some intelligence. So the book, although we had a whole unit that talked about, home, school, community, and intelligence was buried in there, that chapter actually didn't even talk about what the predominant theory of intelligence is. And so in this chapter, we kind of get into that a little bit more. The book talked about crystallized intelligence. So crystallized intelligence is the part of intelligence that accumulates across the lifespan. So we remember that intelligence is not what makes someone smart necessarily. It's not the same thing as being smart. Intelligence is just how well your brain functions, okay? And so there's many different pieces of that. And crystallized intelligence is the stuff that you're able to accumulate across your lifespan because of how your brain functions. So for example, in one of the intelligence tests that I've had to give before, they had a subtest on there that dealt with vocabulary or with comprehension. So for example, asking a question about why or what do you do given a certain circumstance, and there would be certain responses for that. If this was a typical year and if this was a face-to-face class, I would actually pull one of y'all up from the class and I would show you an example of what an intelligence test would look like with people in the room. So crystallized intelligence tends to increase throughout the entire lifespan until we start having issues with our memory. Okay. And so this is why, I don't know if you ever heard before, but the SAT, which is basically just math and English, and it's what some people take, especially on some of the coast, in order to apply for schools, for undergrad schools. Well, the SAT and the GRE, which is the graduate record examination, which people take to go to grad school, actually cover a lot of the same things. The vocabulary portion or the English portion on the GRE is actually a lot more difficult than it is on the SAT. And that's because a lot of that information is crystallized intelligence, stuff that you should be accumulating as you read more. Hopefully you'll learn more vocabulary words and you'll learn things like that. However, if we're looking at the SAT versus the GRE, the math section typically is easier on the GRE than it is on the SAT. And part of that is because it uses some of the fluid intelligence. So fluid intelligence is more your ability for your brain to manipulate information. So for example, as part of this theory, and we won't go into the very specifics, there are other components of intelligence, but spatial reasoning. They consider spatial reasoning a part of intelligence, and that's your ability to manipulate information that is physical. So for example, if you're really great at directions and you can have like a map in your head and you can just navigate there, that's a type of fluid intelligence, specifically spatial reasoning and how things fit together in space. And so fluid intelligence peaks in your 20s and then it declines and declines and declines for the rest of your life. When I started teaching here at UCM, I was 28 years old, and it really hurt my heart because someone in my class was like, "Hey, Dr. Jacobs, you're old now. Have you noticed any change in your fluid intelligence?" And I went home and cried myself to sleep that night. Not really, but it was funny. So we also got to talk about selective optimization with compensation. So this is a three-part step thing that you learned about in your reading. The first step of selective optimization with compensation is to selectively focus on your strengths The second part of this is working harder to perform well with those strengths. And then the third part is to rely on outside aids to cope with weaknesses. And so when we're talking about this, the book is basically talking about it with regards to aging and different things. So as you age, different things don't work the same as they used to. And so it's really helpful to focus on very specific aspects to consistently engage with your strengths, and then to figure out ways to cope with some of your weaknesses. This is not just something that you have to do as you age. This is actually something that's very helpful for people who have ADHD or at any time in the lifespan. So for example, if you really struggle to remember things to do and you're a faculty member, one thing you could do is be like, if someone asks you to do something, tell them to send you an email and then use that email as a to-do list. That's actually what I do. That's one of the strategies I use because I get bombarded with so much information throughout each day that it's really hard to keep track of all 100 of my students at one time. So that's one thing that I do. But I also will then go and play well to my strengths, right? And if there's something that I have a weakness, I'll try to improve it the best I can, but I'm typically going to rely on some sort of outside aid to help me cope with that weakness. And so we see that through the aging process too. So this brings us to post-formal thought. So post-formal thought is kind of an extension of Piaget's cognitive development theory. So post-formal thought is actually a stage that would come after formal operations. So if you remember with Piaget's theory of cognitive development, we had the first stage, which was sensory motor stage, where we learned through our senses and our motor movements. Then we had pre-operational stage, where kids start thinking about things instead of just exploring with the senses and motor movements, but have issues where they're centering on very specific details because their working memory capacity isn't super big yet, right? And then we move on to concrete operations, where children still need really concrete things to look at, but they're able to step back and look at multiple things at one time because their working memory capacity has a few more slots in it, so they can juggle that information. And then we got into formal operational thinking, which was the more adult-like scientific thinking. And it's really interesting because I believe our book said that starts around age 12. They've done some studies and found that there's tons of college students, that something upwards like 50% of college students haven't developed fully formal operational thinking quite yet. And so that was all of Piaget's theory, those specific stages. Post-formal thought stage actually came from the neo-Piagetians, so the new Piagetians, the people who followed after. And Belsky defined this as a uniquely adult form of intelligence. Involves being sensitive to different perspectives, making decisions based on one's inner feelings, being interested in exploring new questions. So with post-formal thought, it's the ability often to step outside of your own perspective and to really see from other people's perspectives. It's learning to navigate gray areas where things are not necessarily black and white all the time, that there's gray, and being able to navigate those things. So it's a more sophisticated type of thought. So we have an application exercise. So what I want you to do now is to go into our Blackboard site, and I want you to go and complete the Big 5 activity. So you're going to take a fun little questionnaire, and you're going to learn more about kind of your attributes on the Big 5. You're going to need to save this. So I want you to save your results, whether that's a screenshot of all of your results, or if you're able to download it into a PDF. And you're going to save these because we're going to use them when we get more details on our final project next week. Okay, so you're going to want to save them along with some of the other activities I've been having you do, and there'll probably be some more to come. So you want to save those because we're going to need them. So the Big 5 then, hopefully you've gone through and done that application exercise already. If not, pause me now and go do it. I'm giving you a few more seconds to pause me now and go take your little thing. So after you've done it, move on to this part in the lecture and discuss with people the results that you got with your Big 5 if you feel comfortable doing it. When we talk about the Big 5, we're talking about personality traits, which hopefully you did the reading before watching the lecture, and you know a little bit about it. I know most of you, I think almost all of you, have taken general psychology, where they cover the Big 5 a little bit. So the Big 5 are 5 different personality traits that people tend to fall on a spectrum. for each of them. One of them is openness to experience, trying new things. And so the opposite of that is not wanting to ever try anything new. And so you fall somewhere on the spectrum where maybe you're always willing to go out and try a new restaurant, or maybe you just like what you like and you're set in your way. So that's just a personality trait that you have. Another one is conscientiousness, or the ability to pay attention to details. Another one is extroversion. So this is being outgoing and getting your power from it. So on one side, we have extroversion. On the other side, we have introversion. And I think a lot of people can operate from one or the other is like their primary function, but I think people can operate with both, right? Just because you're an extrovert doesn't mean that you always want to be on or always out in public, or just because you're introverted doesn't mean you always want to be alone. One way I've heard this explained to me a long time ago, and I don't remember exactly who did it, is it's with extroversion versus introversion. It's where you get your power from. So being out, do you get power or energy from being around people? Does that energize you, or does that exhaust you, right? And so if it exhausts you, you might be more introverted. If it exhilarates you, then you might be extroverted. And just because you're one or the other doesn't mean you can't operate in those different ways, right? Just because you're introverted doesn't mean you can't be a teacher, right? Who has to appear to be extroverted in some ways because they're leading a classroom. And so sometimes those are skills. So the personality trait comes into what is your typical behavior. And so the next one's going to be agreeableness. So this is the opposite of causing conflict and strife with people. So we all know that there's some people who just argue to argue, and they argue all the time. That is the opposite of agreeableness, where it's more into social harmony. The last one that we're going to learn about is neuroticism, and this is someone's propensity to move toward mental illness. So I don't know if y'all listen to any Green Day, but they talk about being neurotic in one of their songs. And this is, really erratic behavior sometimes. It can be really anxiety provoking. So if you're really high in neuroticism, then you have kind of typically will lean more toward having some mental illness struggles in your life. And so when we look at the big five, there is a mnemonic that a lot of people like to use to try to remember these five, and it's ocean. So if you look at the way that I organized them on the slide, you see that the first letter of all of them spell out the word ocean. So that might be a way to try to remember what the big five are as you prepare to move toward our final exam. So with agreeableness, what we see in the lifespan is that it tends to increase until about middle age. And so there's other traits that we see increase with age as well. We see conscientiousness increase with age, agreeableness until middle age, right? And then that's especially in cultures where people get married earlier. We see these things happen. Some decreases. So we also often see some decreases in extroversion as people age across the lifespan. And so when we're talking about increases and decreases, this is typically in comparison to yourself. It's not necessarily in comparison to your peers. So if we took a whole group of people and they were the same age moving through life together, or a cohort like we learned in chapter 1, your extroversion, like you'll probably stay the same place or same ranking. If we're going to rank who's most extroverted to the least extroverted, your ranking within your cohort would probably stay the same. What changes is your own personal extroversion. So if you may be super, super extroverted when younger, and you still may be super extroverted in comparison to your cohort, but whatever level you have, likely, not always, will decrease as you age. And that's the same thing that we're seeing here with conscientiousness and agreeableness. And so we also are coming up on one of Erikson's psychosocial stages. So the major psychosocial stage for this time of life is generativity versus stagnation. So in generativity versus stagnation, I like to use a metaphor to kind of describe what this is. So I like to think of for generativity, I like to think of this nice lush forest, and there's squirrels singing and bunnies hopping around in circles and dancing. And so I think of it as flourishing. This is when you're giving back to the community and you're helping bring up the next generation. Your life has purpose and meaning. While stagnation, I like to think of that nasty, stagnant pond where the mosquitoes have decided to grow. because it's not moving. It's nasty. It smells bad because the water's not moving. There's a ton of nasty things everywhere. That's what I like to think about with the stage. So people, when they go through the generativity versus stagnation stage, either people tend to flourish, keep growing, give back to the next generation somehow, or they just stagnate and stay the same and there's no growth. And that can be really, really sad to witness, to be honest. So with Erickson, when Erickson was talking about generativity versus stagnation, what do you think he was meaning with generativity versus stagnation? What type of activities or life choices would lead to someone being generative? Feel free to discuss in the comments. Okay, so now hopefully after y'all have discussed in those comments, we can talk about it a little bit. So typically if we think about Erickson, who wrote in a different zeitgeist. If we remember what zeitgeist is, that's the spirit of the times. It was really expected that people followed the social clock that we learned about in the last chapter, where there was just things that you did. You went to school, you started a job, you got married, you had kids, you did all these things in order. So when we're talking about generativity here, one of the major ways that people can accomplish that is through having children. We know that's not as prevalent as a thing as it used to be. In fact, with the extra readings that you did in last week's unit, looking at the birth rate, we're seeing a heavily big decrease in the number of children that Americans are having. This is actually something that we're seeing in many different countries. And so that might not apply to everyone, but that is not the only way that you can be generative. What are some other ways besides having children that you might be able to give back to the next generation? So there's several ways. It could be coaching baseball. It could be working at Kansas City Community Gardens. It could be, Big Brothers, Big Sisters. It could be any sorts of thing where you give your time. It could be teaching. It could be being a professor. It could be any number of things. It could be being a ballet teacher, where you're helping mold people's mind and make the world a better place. So when we look at generative adults' memory, so these are people who, when they're in the stage generativity versus stagnation, tend to resolve the stage on the side of generativity. When we look at their memories, we see some very common sequences, okay? So with it, a lot of times we'll see something called a commitment script, and this is where they thought, when I was younger, I was my grandparents' favorite grandchild, or I was always been so blessed, things like that. Those are commitment scripts. And then we have to see something called redemption sequences. So if someone went through something really difficult, they say that it needed to happen, or it was for a reason, or that happened and it changed my life in a better way. So I think the book talks about someone who went to prison. So if I hadn't got arrested and I went to prison, then I would have never changed my life for the better. Or if I never had children, then I would have kept going down a certain path that wasn't great for my life. Those are types of redemption sequences. And so it's going through some sort of difficult journey, but if it wasn't for that journey, you wouldn't be able to help other people with the same problem. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about this, that maybe they had an alcohol dependency problem, and they're actually thankful that they had gone through it and gotten help, even though it was really, really hard, because then they were able to help other people make that journey so that they could have a quality life and stop kind of destroying their life. And so they find purpose in the things that really hurt them at some point. So we also can talk about happiness. They talked about hedonic happiness, which is basically things that feel good. So this could be like getting a massage or eating chocolate, things like that, things that bring like a physical sensation to yourself. They also talked about eudaimonic happiness, which is basically, it's a higher level of happiness within. So like if you've ever done something for someone and you didn't do it to get any recognition or anything, but you did it and it just brought you so much happiness inside, that would be the eudaimonic happiness. And so when we're thinking about the activities that we're doing in life, it's really important to kind of balance some of these things too, like what gives your life meaning, what gives you purpose, because purpose is something that can bring you this type of happiness as well. So the book also talks about grandparenthood really briefly. And there's three things that they had under this area. One of them isn't necessarily about grandparenthood, but we'll talk about it here just because that's where the book organized it in this edition of the book. So the book talked about family watchdogs. So this is when you have somebody who's a grandparent, who's the lookout for the family, the one who takes care of the family, that helps emotionally support people when they go through a circumstance. And that's a common role that people will have in grandparenthood. Another thing that they spoke about in here is caregiving grandparents. So these are grandparents who are raising their grandchildren as their own. And I think there's actually several people in this section of the class that had grandparents who raised them. I know that in this semester in my face-to-face class, there's several people who have had their grandparents raise them because their biological parents weren't in a place to be able to take care of them in the way that they needed. And so the third one that I think should fit under grandparenthood because it's not really about grandparenthood is parent care. And so this is when people are taking care of their older parents who are declining because they're aging. And so there used to be a saying called sandwich parents, where they're still taking care of their children, but also taking care of their parents at the same time. And that's a really common phrase. And they're starting to see a lot of that because of the differences in birth cohorts. So we're seeing that a lot of people are delaying, if they're going to have children at all, that they're going to push that off into later in their life. And so what we're seeing is then they have their children at an older age, and their parents are also aging because of when their parents had children. And so then they end up taking care of both without a break in between. So that's all we have for this week in terms of the lecture. Make sure that if you didn't go through and do that Big Five activity, that you go ahead and do that, because we're going to need to look at that next week as I move into giving you more formal directions on what our final project is. I hope that you all will really like it. It's a brand new project this year that I've spent a lot of time on, and I was hoping that it would be pleasant and a lot more fun than writing a paper. So hopefully you guys are okay with not writing 3 papers like I've done in the past. And we're going to do a little bit of self-exploration. And basically, I'm calling it the Choose Your Own Adventure. And we're going to look at things like your personality. We're going to have an activity where you do your Holland work type. We're going to look at all these different things, and you're going to plan your life or choose your own adventure. So that's all I got for you this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you soon.